Good morning, everyone. First episode of the podcast, which I've been wanting to do for quite a long time, to be honest. I did have a go at doing a podcast when I first started my YouTube channel a few years back, but I wasn't really ready. Everything had to be scripted. I had to think for everything in detail. And I frankly don't think I had enough topics to talk about. I hadn't thought through things properly by that point. But now is the right time, I think. A lot of things are coming together. I've got a lot of work that I want to put out and share, and basically just get involved with the entire scene, for lack of a better word. Who am I? Who the hell am I? Who the hell are you listening to? My name is Tony VC Low, and I otherwise just go by my initials online, TVC. Well, what career do I have? It's hard to say. I sometimes work in construction. I sometimes work as a landscaper or do what you might call farm work. I sometimes work as a teacher, and I also work online now as well. I've now set up this thing called the TVC Academy because my background really is in philosophy. That's always been my main interest or forte. But I didn't pursue philosophy as a career because the modern state of philosophical education, at least from what I experienced at my university, is so abysmal. What I noticed when I went to uni was that you don't really learn how to know the truth, which is what I thought philosophy was always going to be about. And that could be the truth about any number of things, the truth about the nature of knowledge or logic or science, the nature of our understanding, the truth about society, what it is and how we interact with it, the truth about politics, the truth about economics, any number of things. But when I got to university, I wasn't really learning about how to... First of all, I didn't really learn what was true. But not even that. I wasn't even equipped to learn what was true. I didn't get the tools of basic understanding. I mean, one of the main things I point out to people is that I had done 5 years of academic education by the time I'd finished. And only in the 6th year, so after I'd finished my degree, did I actually learn what an axiom was, which is quite startling if you think about it, because the axiom is like the most basic part of logical thinking. It's like the thing you start with before you do anything else. And I didn't even know what one was until I got out of university. Now, fortunately, my first 2 years of college, because in the UK it's a bit strange compared to the rest of the world, what we call college is for people who are of the ages of, say, 16 to 18. So we go from secondary school, which I think is what the Yanks, for example, would call high school, or the Europeans. But we go from secondary school to college, which is usually for 2 years. And then after college, we go to what we call university, which is what you guys, if you're American, would call college, right? So that's 18 plus kind of thing. So in any case, I went to college, 16, 17, 18 years old, and that education was actually pretty decent. We didn't really study what I think was much more basic, looking back on it now, like things to do with the nature of logic and that kind of thing. But we did look at some decent thinkers at the very least. So we looked at people like Plato and Aristotle. We looked at even some of the more modern thinkers like Descartes and Hume. They were good because they still, I think in many ways, they're basically wrong now. I was having a conversation with someone about Hume the other day, and Hume is profoundly wrong in many of his assertions. But at least they gave their due respect to the nature of reason and objective truth. That is what I respect, at least, about the post-Enlightenment thinkers, immediately within the realm of the Enlightenment in many cases. So Descartes, for example, made decent appeals to reason. Kant, despite his faults, made decent appeals to reason. When I got to university, a lot of that was being thrown straight out of the window, and we were reading people like Foucault or Heidegger or Derrida. And these people basically wrote really sophisticated opinion pieces. and they dressed it up as philosophy, which was is a complete travesty as far as I'm concerned. These people aren't philosophers, they're sophists. And the more and more you read their work, the more you realize that they obfuscate, or they the thing that they're most guilty of is the fact that they write in a very complex and opaque way to say basically nothing. I think that's the thing I hated probably the most about their work. The thing is, it's not just a case of disagreeing with someone. Their conclusions were also horrific. But if they had laid their arguments out clearly and reached their conclusions in a rational way, that's much more respectable, because at least you feel like you're playing the same game. You're playing the game of truth. They just happen to have reached a different point, or they've just reached a different conclusion. That I can respect. But when you're trying to hide your ideas or what you understand to be the truth, if you're trying to dress it up or give this, because obviously what they do with that kind of language, when you see this really complex, convoluted, needlessly convoluted language that the postmodernists use, it's a way of hiding their thoughts so that people who aren't smart enough to realize what they're doing go, these guys are talking in a really complex way. I can't understand how complicated it is. Therefore, they must be much, much smarter than I am. Therefore, they might probably be right. Yeah, that's the game. But obviously, it's not the case at all, because if you go back through and unpack exactly what they're saying, yes, some of it can be very complex, but it really is nonsense at the end of the day, right? So that's what I experienced with the postmodernists. But at least in my basic foundational education in college, I was dealing with philosophers who actually dealt in reason and objective truth in a fairly clear way. And luckily we had some really good teachers. They articulated these ideas in a very clear way as well. So, when we looked at people like Plato, I had a clear idea of what he meant by his forms and that kind of thing. I wish we had done more Aristotle. I've done Aristotle more recently, and he's probably the best philosopher who's ever lived. But anyway, that gives you a bit of a background about where I was mentally with my work post-university. So it's a bit of a precursor, but let me explain why that's relevant. That's all relevant because when I left university, I had some basic tools in place. By that point, I learned how to write an essay, for example, how to formulate an argument, because despite the faults of my course, I actually still was able to choose work which was rationally robust. So I'd learned some basic reasoning skills. I had learned how to write an essay. I'd learned basically the overview of philosophy as a whole. So I knew all of the main arguments from all of the main thinkers, which was quite helpful. Everyone from Rousseau and Marx to Thomas Hobbes and, not just the political stuff, but yeah, we had people like John Locke and Descartes and Hume and Aristotle and Plato, all these different ideas of epistemology and how do we know reality. I was even introduced to some Catholic thinkers such as St. Augustine and St. Aquinas, despite the fact that I was an ardent atheist at the time. I'm not now, so that's another part of the story. But in any case, I'd had this overview, but when I left university, I had this really interesting conversation with one of my classmates. One of the classmates who, like me, kind of saw that a lot of the stuff wasn't adding up and that the course didn't really make any sense. Why we stuck with it to the very end, I don't know. It's a different topic. But we came out of university and looked at each other, and I said, "Did you get a good grade in your dissertation?" "Yeah, I got a great grade, thank you." "Okay, so we've been able to pass the course." "Yeah, but let me ask you something. Do you actually know how to tell the difference between truth and falsehood? Like, when it comes down to how we tell what's true and what isn't, do you think you would be able to answer how we do that?" And she looked at me and just went, "No, not really. Not really at all." We knew a lot of arguments. We knew a lot of pros and cons for a lot of those arguments. We even knew how to formulate arguments, or so we thought, enough to get a grade. But we didn't know how to tell what was true. Not really. Now, looking back on it, we actually had some vague. Everyone always knows how to tell the truth to some degree, because all of us are rational creatures. So we always had levers that we could pull and things we were working with in order to make that possible. But we didn't have an explicit understanding of that. And that threw me for a bit of a loop for a while, because that is basically why I was pursuing philosophy. I, in many ways, find the world fairly confusing, or at least did much more back then than I do now. I think things are becoming much clearer by the day. But I had left university without knowing actually what truth is, or how to really understand it. So I had to backtrack a bit. So I went back and studied things like the nature of logic, Aristotle's laws of thought, reason, going back through some of the philosophy 101, like, well, what is epistemology? How do we approach it? What is ethical theory? How do we approach metaphysics? All this kind of stuff. And after a while, I think I got a grasp. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think I got a grasp on what the hell it's all about. At the very least, I mean, 90% of the work was done just by understanding what logic was, because my education had kind of put all these pieces of the puzzle in place, even the bad stuff. Because the thing about my university degree was that despite the fact that it was very bad, it kind of taught me about what I would call anti-philosophy or anti-truth. And that's useful to know. It's useful to kind of know what you're up against, or what you shouldn't do as a philosopher. So in that way, that was kind of informative by itself, because you can reverse engineer that, or you can look at the opposite side, right? You can say, well, if this is what philosophy shouldn't be, and I know that much at least, then what's the counterpart? What would the opposite look like? And that gives you an idea of really what it should be about. So I think 90% of what we need, so like I said, I learned about logic, and a lot of the courses I had done had put all these pieces of the puzzle in place. And then when I understood logic properly, then everything just kind of snapped into place, and it made everything so much clearer. Now, obviously, there's still a lot to learn, still a lot to explore, but that really laid the foundation for having some level of intellectual competence in approaching truth and matters of critical thinking, I suppose, is the important thing to consider. Anyway, that's a long preamble about my education. So why does that bring me to where we are now? Why am I doing this podcast? Why am I even speaking to you? Well, I've been able to go back through, and because of everything that's happened, I've basically had to learn personally how to deal with matters of truth. In a sense, I've had to learn how to learn. But to learn how to be given information, because I can't trust the information I'm given from universities, who are supposed to be the most trustworthy institution in our society for this kind of thing. So I knew I couldn't trust them. We can't trust the news. We can't trust the news. Can't trust, in many cases, the opinions of people around us, because they're in many ways as confused as we are, and don't even know how they would know things if they needed to. So we're kind of left without a great deal of options. So I had to deal with that situation. I had to look at it in the face and think, okay, but what tools are there then? Independent of all these other factors, what tools are there that we can use to look at the information that we're given in front of us, whoever that might be from, wherever that might be from, and say, okay, these bits of information are good, that makes sense, maybe I can factor that into my understanding, and no, these bits don't make any sense, I need to remove that needs to go out. How do we do that? And so I've had to deal with that question personally, kind of from the bottom up, because that's what I do with my philosophy. This is stuff that's happening in the background for the moment. I have done some published work on this, but I'm really interested in the fundamentals of philosophy. What are our most basic tools? What are our most basic axioms? When we dig right down to how we know what we know and why we know how we know it, what's at bedrock there? What's the foundation? And then what can we can proceed to build upon. Those are the kind of questions at heart I'm really interested in. But I don't do it academically because academia is a waste of time. Not only is it a waste of time from an educational point of view, but also from a financial point of view. Like, it's basically a living meme that philosophers don't earn any money. The only options I would have had as a career being a philosopher is if I had basically gone and recycled myself back into the education system and become a teacher, either at the university level or something lower. So that gave me the option of staying in university, which first of all I didn't want to do, and then I would have to teach other students all of the nonsense I'd been taught for the last 3 years. No, it was never going to happen. I frankly believe that it was better for me to carry bags of cement up staircases than it was to do that kind of thing, which is basically what I did. One of the first jobs I had after I left university was carrying some bags of cement up staircases. So that gives you a bit of an overview of why I am where I am. So I do a number of things now. I do construction work in many senses as my bread and butter. But in the background, I've been trying to pursue this kind of intellectual part of my life and this intellectual career. One of the things I do is I do work as a teacher. I teach foreign language, the English language, to foreign speakers. But also, I now create courses as well. I'm trying to set up something that I would call the TVC Academy, where I deal with a lot of these things that I've just been speaking about, right? If the modern education system leaves us wanting for things like really decent critical thinking skills, really decent learning skills, and the real bedrock skills that we need to distinguish truth from falsity, if it leaves us wanting for those things, well, is there room to explain what those things are? And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So, for example, and this will sound like a plug, but I'm just going to tell you some of the things I've done. For example, I looked into the education system called the Trivium, which is the traditional classical education system, basically, that was used mostly through the height of Catholicism. And that is a brilliant system because it combines grammar, logic, and rhetoric together to give you a comprehensive understanding of basically any subject. So if you understand the grammar of a subject, that basically gives you the materials that you need to form your understanding with, right? What's the data? What are the basic parts? What are the skills? And then you look at logic as a discipline as a way to tie all of those elements together, right? So if I've got all of these pieces of information, how do they form a coherent shape? And then with rhetoric, funnily enough, it's not just about speaking in a fancy way. Rhetoric, most broadly considered, is about taking the understanding that you form together, that you glue together with your logic, and then articulating that clearly for people so that they can understand it as well. And when you move through those 3 stages, then that's when you gain mastery of a subject, basically. So it's beautifully systematic. It's at once systematic and flexible, right? It's at once thorough whilst being elastic, and that's one of the most beautiful things about that system. So that was the first thing I covered. I'm also now in the process of covering, and I'll probably release these as courses quite soon, the Socratic method. The Socratic method is profoundly useful simply as a tool of thinking within your own mind. It's basically, if you understand what the Socratic method really is, it just becomes a running test for all of your ideas that you have running inside your own head, which is profoundly useful. So you take on a new belief, or you're thinking through, do I really believe what I believe? Why do I believe it? What grounds do I have for believing what I believe? Are my beliefs strong and can I rely on them? Or are they perhaps tenuous and wanting in some way? This is what you constantly test if you can internalize the Socratic method and have it as a thought system, as a skill really, that you can use. And not only that, but you can use it with other people as well. So if you learn Socratic method, how to use that by yourself, you can sit down with someone, some respectable friend or a partner, and ask them about their beliefs as well, and help them clear up what they're thinking, basically. And have a stronger sense of the truth, basically, that they can have more conviction in. So that's Socratic method. And the other main thing that I'm currently in the process of looking at is simply logic. simply logic as a whole. It's covered a bit in the Trivium series, but the idea there is that it's covered in the Trivium series for the Trivium system as a whole. So it acts as kind of like a bridge or a glue that ties all of that together. But there is more to say about it overall. So I'm looking at making a course on what I'm going to call an enhanced introduction to logic, because the idea is that it introduces you to logic, what it is, how it functions, why it's important, all that kind of stuff. But it goes an extra step and kind of ties it more into philosophy. And the idea of that course is going to be that this teaches you everything you want to know about logic if you're going to use it in basically 90% of your life. The only thing, admittedly, that I don't go into detail is like really formal mathematical logic. I talk about formal logic so people know at least what it is and how it functions, right? But it won't teach you, for example, how to do like advanced physics, mathematics, or advanced like computer equations and stuff like that. Or even really advanced philosophical, formal, symbolic types of reasoning. That's all the stuff that either you know about it, you don't worry. But doesn't teach you how to do that stuff in detail, but it will at least give an overview, again, as an introductory to what it is, so that if you took that course, you would be equipped to use logic in, like I said, 95% of your like daily life. Whether you're having arguments with people about politics or just having conversations with people about anything that's going on in life. And then it would equip you to move on to more symbolic, formal forms of reasoning if you so chose to. So that was the idea, or that is the idea of that course, which is currently in development. So those are the kind of things that I'm doing with my academy, basically. I'm taking these, what I think are foundational topics, and I'm trying to convey them in a very clear and concise way. Now, hopefully the podcast was seen as a different project to that, because these aren't going to be anywhere near as concise, as you can probably tell from this episode so far. The idea of the podcast is that, aside from these courses, which I need to approach in a systematic and fairly professional way, there's always just more things to talk about and to think about. And I enjoy podcasts. Like my main medium, I must profess, is not, I don't read anywhere near as much as I listen. I prefer the listening medium far more, whether it be podcasts or audiobooks. So this is the way I like to consume my media. And so I don't see why I shouldn't make this the way that other people consume the media that I create. It just seems sensible. It seems fair in a weird way. So there are still many different things to discuss, many topics to go through, which don't really deserve a course by themselves. So that's kind of the idea behind the podcast. There's a way to kind of speak to people more about the various other things that are worth speaking about. So that's a bit of who I am, and so that kind of explains my intellectual development and explains why I'm here making the intellectual work that I make as well. I write books, by the way, too, under my name, Tony VC Lowe. I've only written a couple so far, but I definitely have a few more that I want to write. It's balancing those with the courses is an interesting time thing, because obviously I'm working aside from that as well. But that explains the kind of intellectual part of my development and explains why I'm here now. There's been a bunch of other things going on in the last couple of years as well, which brings me here. Not least was my conversion to Catholicism. And when I say Catholicism, I mean I'm a traditional Orthodox Catholic. And I have nothing to do with the current imposters and Satanists that currently reside within Rome. It's a tricky way to approach the conversation, because unless you know at least something about what that means, it sounds crazy from the outset. Oh, so you're a Catholic, but you don't accept the Pope. No, I'm a Catholic because I don't accept a non-Pope. That's the idea there. But that's another huge conversation in its own right, because Catholicism wasn't something, my reaching that conclusion wasn't something that happened overnight. Certainly not. I mean, I was an ardent really ardent atheist for most of my life. I was born into a vaguely, and I mean really vaguely, Catholic family. But I mean, two things are worth considering there. First of all, I now understand that it wasn't really Catholic. It was Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo Church is a distinct and separate religion from the Catholic Church. It's as if someone steals your ID and then says that they're you. Well, no, on the face of it, it looks like you to someone who knows nothing about you. But to people who know you, they know, no, actually this person is a complete imposter and they're just pretending to be you. That's the difference between the two different types of Catholic Church that we have on show at the moment. One is genuine and one is simply an imposter who's wearing the same clothes. So the church I was raised in, or I should say introduced to as a child, was this imposter church, which was dressing itself up as the Catholic Church. Now, neither of my parents were religious at all. Not at all. The only reason why I ever got involved in Catholicism was, first of all, because I had a nan, a grandmother, you might say, who is Maltese and therefore quite devout in her faith. So I sometimes attended church with her when she would look after me. But I also went to Catholic school. The reason why I went to Catholic school is my parents pretended to be interested in Catholicism so that I would get into a school that would probably have a better standard of education. That was their thinking. But by the time I could think, which was probably around the age of like 12 or 13, I'd probably say 14. 14 is when I really started to thinking about it. By that time, I'd already considered religion to be absolutely nonsensical and a tyrannical waste of, not only a waste of time, but a waste of life, basically. It was, I'd concluded quite quickly that Christianity taken as a whole, and all religion in fact, was simply a tyrannical farce designed to keep stupid people stupid and to control people. That was basically it. And obvious nonsense as well, as I concluded in my burgeoning teenage arrogance. So I came to Catholicism eventually, but the roadmap is a bit long. It took exactly, I'd say, 2.5 years. Exactly was the wrong word. It took around 2.5 years, but possibly 3. No, 2.5. What had happened was I was actually profoundly humbled by the experience of university. I must admit that. That was one of the most useful things about going, because I had entered university with a number of really strong conclusions about what I thought was true. And this was over a range of topics. So, like I said, I'd convinced myself that atheism as a belief system was true, or as a stance. So I was convinced that I knew everything that I needed to know about religion. But I also was convinced I knew basically everything I needed to know about science and society and politics and economics and all these other topics that really I didn't have any understanding of at all. Not really. A very, very superficial understanding. And so what happened was I go to university and I would indeed get introduced to many other different ideas and many other different challenges. So I would make some really outrageous claims about scientific fact. And someone would ask me the question, for example, how do you know that? What do you mean by science? Have you ever even thought about that question? Have you thought about it properly? And I realized, no, I haven't really. Not really. And the same thing it definitely happened with politics and definitely happened with economics as well. So I came out of university realizing that many things I was otherwise confident in to the point of stupidity, I was in fact profoundly wrong about in many cases. So I thought, well, and by that time I'd actually cleared up a lot of my thinking. I was much more confident by the end. And I knew that some of my conclusions I should and could have much more confidence in. But that's besides the point. The point is that I'd gone through all of that at university and thought, well, if I was wrong about everything else, maybe I was wrong about religion too. Maybe there was something that I was missing about religion that I hadn't seen before. Do I really understand Christianity as much as I thought I did? And that's the question that was bugging me by the time I'd left. So as it happens, I lived basically around the corner from an Anglican church, right? So Church of England. I lived around the corner from one, and I thought, I'm just going to ask them. I'm going to ask them about Christianity. So what I did is I went to this church and I started speaking to the priest, and he invited me along to like dinners and group meetings and discussion sessions. And the idea there was I just asked these Christians basically every question I could. Every question I thought I could pose to a Christian that would absolutely just destroy all credibility of their faith. And this lasted quite a while. Over the course of like months. So maybe like one or two meetings a week or something. And in the midst of that, I was listening to people speak online. I was keeping an eye on various, I suppose you'd call them chat groups. I was also reading and starting to listen to numerous books as well. So as just a clear example, was something as simple as Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I read that. It's not even very long. It's not even particularly deep, theologically speaking. But I read that and thought, okay, I actually knew nothing about Christianity. And this is someone who had gone to Catholic primary school and Catholic secondary school, right? Who would have, well, in air quotes, a weekly mass. And it wasn't until I read Mere Christianity that I realized that Jesus was supposed to be God, for example, which is huge, right? I remember saying that to one of my friends who I lived with, and he had gone to school with me. He wasn't going for any conversion or anything like that, but I remember saying to him, "Look, mate, do you realize that Jesus was supposed to be God?" And he looked at me and went, "No, surely not. No. I'm pretty sure that if that was the case, someone would have told me by now." And so that gives you an idea of kind of where I was. So I was learning all of these things and realizing I actually knew nothing about Christianity at all. And aside from that, these questions that I mentioned that I was asking all of these people, I found out that they actually had really good answers. And what surprised me was that, okay, not all of these answers were completely convincing, as if like they were going to convert me directly to the faith. But they showed more than anything else that Christianity really is consistent. And that's quite something. A religion which is as old as that, with as many doctrines as it has, is consistent. And that's what I started to learn too. And then I also started to really learn that it's moral as well, which surprised me. I thought it was basically an epicenter of evil. But really it is moral. It is the seat of morality as far as I'm concerned. It's the wellspring of all goodness and truth as far as we actually live by it. Because God is the wellspring of all goodness and truth, and he exists, so where else is it going to come from? But these thoughts weren't as clear in my mind by that point as they are now. But even then I started to realize, okay, it's consistent. Okay, they've got answers to these questions. It could very well be true. It could very well be true. And I think I really should try to live in a more Christian way as well. I started to take on board Christian morality. I started to drink less. I started to do drugs less. I started to have different ideas about what relationships and duties were like. And eventually it was kind of weaning me off the life I'd been living before that. Because before that I'd been living a very hedonistic and atheistic life. And so, long story short, I reached a point where I thought, okay, I'm not completely, it's not like I had all of my questions answered. And I still have some, I must admit. But I thought it's as believable as any other belief system I've come across, if not more so compared to many. It's at least as believable. And damn it, I'm also trying to live life as a Christian as well. So what does that say to me? What it says, I basically believe in Christianity. And I basically, for that reason, am a Christian. So by that point, I accepted I was a Christian. Now, it's worth mentioning that during this process, was also doing what I mentioned before. I was learning about the difference between truth and falsity. I was trying to backtrack my logical understanding. I was reading people like Aristotle and realizing that, the relation between our reason and truth and all this kind of stuff. And I was really had my eyes on logic and what that does for the nature of truth. And for that reason, I was quickly brought over to Catholicism, because I had already started getting vibes from Protestant churches. I'd been to a couple by that point, because I had gone to what you would call an Anglican or Church of England church. But even if you were going to ask the people in that congregation, "Are you Anglican?" they would look at you kind of uncomfortably and be like, "Well, no, not really. I'm just Christian. I'm just Christian," right? Which means they're Protestant or non-denominational in some vague way, but obviously not Catholic. So I went to that. I also went to a Black Pentecostal church for a couple of weeks. That was quite interesting. Very loud. And I'd gone to a couple of other churches as well. And I was getting a vibe. There was a weird... something just didn't add up. And one of the things that didn't add up is that they were all approaching Christianity in a different way. And I'd already got this sense that, but truth should be consistent, and truth is one, right? Doesn't mean it can't be complex, doesn't mean it's monochromatic. And I explain that in a lot of my work, but you can't have like glaring inconsistencies. That doesn't make any sense. And one of the other things that really struck me was the fact that it was very soft, because I'd always had a very... what's the best way to phrase this? I'm not pessimistic, but I'm not at all surprised by how much evil there is in the world. I suppose that's the best way to put it. I suppose I was more pessimistic in the past, but Catholicism has definitely been a salve for that. It's healed that quite a lot. But it's done that without me having to have any naive conceptions about what the world is like and how bad it really is at a deep level. There's a lot of very evil people in the world, and they do a lot of very evil things all of the time. And in many cases, as bad as you think things are, or as bad as, or as malicious as you think people can be, in many cases they can actually even surprise you then. It can be worse. So I was always aware of that. I was fairly aware of that by the time I got to Christianity as a whole, if you like, broadly speaking. And so when I got into these churches, I thought, okay, everything is adding up. The philosophy is making sense. But you guys seem profoundly naive. Like the fact that they had pop concerts in the church was a really good indication of that. And this real overemphasis on being nice whilst ignoring the fact that we live in a world which is absolutely soaked through with evil, and that requires some kind of clear, sober-minded fighting spirit in order to deal with that. It was more like the Protestants I was meeting were just hung up on convincing themselves that everything was nice and fine. And they were using Jesus as a way to prove that to themselves. Everything is fine. There's nothing I need to worry about in life. The world is basically all good and happy in sunshine because Jesus exists and he loves me and I'm already saved, right? That was the kind of impression I was getting. The Catholics didn't have that attitude at all. When I started to listen and speak to the Catholics I currently now, say work with, or who I now respect, they had a fighting spirit. They were looking evil in the face. They weren't shy about its existence at all. And they weren't shy about their place in the fight either, saying that, no, I'm not necessarily saved either. I have a responsibility towards God. I have a duty towards God, and I need to recognize that. They took everything so much more seriously, and that's what really struck me too. So these were the two main things that I saw in Catholicism at the start. They took it much more seriously. And think about that, right? Because if God exists, if the devil exists, and the soul exists, then the stakes really couldn't be higher. On the line is a difference between the source of all possible goodness, beauty, and truth himself, and the father of lies, and a being who hates your soul and your existence more than you can ever possibly imagine. And between that, there is your soul, And it's either going to find its way into eternal bliss and goodness, or it's going to fall into everlasting damnation and hellfire, right? It's pretty serious. The game is on, you could say. But you don't get that impression from Protestant churches. And if God exists as well, then here you have this absolute majesty of being, which is taller than 10,000 mountains, right? Which is greater and more majestic than anything we could possibly ever even conceive. And he indeed is our Lord and Saviour. He was indeed willing to come down into the world, into life, to suffer and die for us. And we sit in his presence every time we, for example, sit in church or pray or attend Mass, right? That's huge. It's huge and it's deep and it's important. And it's really, really worth taking seriously. So the Catholics recognize that too. And the Catholics, proper traditional Orthodox Catholics, are reverential for that reason as well. And that's another important factor. So I saw these two things at play. I saw the fact that the Catholics were serious. They were reverential. And they were logical as well. And this was probably the clinching point. Because they pointed out that if truth is consistent, if truth is one, if truth doesn't contradict itself, then Protestantism can't possibly be true as a belief system taken as a whole, right? Because the God of truth himself would not want a church which is divided amongst itself into 40,000 different denominations, all with contradicting beliefs, all with incompatible belief systems. That doesn't make any sense. It can't possibly be true. So within a nutshell, boom, that basically did Protestantism for me. Kind of leaves Eastern Orthodoxy, but that still doesn't work because they're still kind of divided. So it only leaves really Catholicism. But then luckily, these same Catholics who were presenting these clear, logical arguments to me, shout out for people like Giuseppe Filotto, for example, also made it clear that the church wasn't what we know it to be. Right? And I think everyone who even thinks for a minute gets a sense of this. How do you explain all of the corruption? How do you explain all the paedophilia? How do you explain the fact that Catholicism, this ideal of Catholicism, those churches are looking much, much more like the Protestant churches. They're also getting their rock bands together. They also don't really seem to care about the great grand fight between good and evil and the reverence we owe to our Lord and all these kinds of things. What's going on there? That doesn't make any sense. We know from logic that Catholicism looks like the one, but this church that calls itself the Catholic Church doesn't do the job that we think it's supposed to. So that's when I was lucky enough to find these people who were making these arguments, who made it very clear that not only is it a matter of opinion that the Catholic Church isn't doing what it's supposed to, it's actually a matter of dogmatic fact that it's not. It's actually a matter of dogmatic church law that this fake church can't be the Catholic Church. And that was very interesting to discover. And those arguments are actually quite easy to make if you know the details of them, or even some of the just core principles. And indeed, I've done now direct work on those arguments. So, for example, if you read my book, To Catch a Fake Catholic, that explains that pretty well. Also, you can read books like Believe by Giuseppe Filotto and his other book, Reclaiming the Catholic Church. And there are many other resources. If you look at what's called the Sedevacantist position, which is the idea that the seat of St. Peter is currently lacking a legitimate claimant. So here I am, basically. I mean, so I went through that process, and the philosophy and stuff brought me to Christianity. Christianity then brought me to Catholicism. Catholicism then brought me to traditional Orthodox Catholicism. I started attending traditional masses. I started becoming part of the traditional church. And very quickly, after I learned a bit more, I thought, this is it. This is where the truth is, for sure. And so that is now also informing a huge part of my life. And that forms who I am as a person. So I think overall, and I don't want to speak much longer because I think I'm going to overrun on my time now, but overall that gives you a sense of who I am and what I'm about, and what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the truth, and I'm interested in philosophy, and I'm interested in knowing not only what the truth is, but how we know what the truth is and how we interact with it. How do we get ourselves through all of the mess and mire and confusion that the world, especially the modern world, presents with us? And how do we have our own confidence and tools to progress towards what the truth actually is, and to know it and to live by it with confidence? Those are the kind of things that I've been trying to figure out. And those are the kind of things that I want to help other people figure out as well. So that the journey that has been taking me multiple years so far, perhaps can take people just a few months instead. That would be the ideal. So, yeah, that's me, I suppose. How do you end a podcast in a decent way? Well, I suppose you can find me at the TVC Academy. That's where I do my courses. I should have a website by the time this is out. Links will be hopefully available in the description. You'll be able to listen to me on multiple places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I've also got a YouTube channel as well. So if you look up TVC on YouTube, you can see my YouTube channel. So, yeah, nice to meet you all. And God bless you. And thank you very much for your time.